The sound of distant explosions echoed through the dusty streets of Kandahar as Navy SEAL medic Jake Harrison crouched behind a crumbling concrete wall, his medical kit clutched tightly in his weathered hands. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the Afghan city, creating waves of heat that danced above the rubble-strewn road ahead. His team had been conducting a routine patrol when the ambush struck, scattering his unit and leaving 2 wounded soldiers pinned down in an abandoned building 3 blocks away. Jake's radio crackled with urgent voices as his team leader, Chief Petty Officer Marcus Rodriguez, coordinated the rescue operation. The static-filled transmission painted a grim picture. Taliban fighters had taken strategic positions throughout the neighborhood, turning what should have been a simple extraction into a deadly game of cat and mouse. Jake checked his watch, noting that his wounded teammates had been trapped for nearly 40 minutes. In this heat, with potential internal bleeding, time was becoming their worst enemy. "Harrison, we need you to move up to the north side." Rodriguez's voice cut through the chaos. "There's a civilian casualty reported in the building adjacent to our guys. Female, appears to be trapped under debris. We can't leave her behind." Jake felt his stomach tighten. Civilian casualties were always the hardest part of these operations. Unlike trained soldiers who understood the risks, innocent people caught in crossfire represented the human cost of war that haunted every medic's dreams. He had seen too many families torn apart, too many lives cut short by violence they never asked for. But his oath was clear: treat the wounded, regardless of who they were or how they ended up needing help. Moving carefully through the maze of destroyed vehicles and scattered concrete blocks, Jake made his way toward the target building. The structure had once been a small apartment complex, but rocket fire had collapsed most of the upper floors, creating a dangerous pile of twisted metal and broken masonry. Dust hung in the air like a brown curtain, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. As he approached the building's entrance, Jake could hear muffled voices coming from inside. His teammates were calling out to each other, trying to maintain communication while staying hidden from enemy fire. The sound of a woman crying softly drifted through a gap in the rubble, confirming the civilian casualty report. Jake's training kicked in as he assessed the tactical situation. 3 potential patients, unknown enemy positions, and a structure that looked ready to collapse at any moment. The woman's cries were coming from a small room on the ground floor, partially blocked by a fallen beam. Jake could see her through a crack in the debris. She appeared to be in her late 20s, wearing a dark blue hijab that was now torn and covered in dust. What struck him immediately was her composure despite the obvious pain. While tears ran down her dirt-streaked face, she wasn't screaming or panicking like most civilians would in this situation. Instead, she seemed to be methodically checking her own injuries, running her hands along her arms and legs with a practiced efficiency that seemed oddly familiar. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Jake called out in his limited Dari, hoping she could understand. "I'm a medic. I'm here to help." The woman's head turned toward his voice, and Jake was struck by the intensity of her dark eyes. Despite her obvious pain, there was a sharpness there and alertness that spoke of training and discipline. Most civilians in her situation would be looking at him with desperate hope or terror, but her gaze was calculating, assessing, as if she was evaluating him as much as he was evaluating her situation. "I speak English," she replied, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "My leg is trapped, but I don't think it's broken. There may be internal bleeding, I can taste copper, and my left side feels wrong." Jake was impressed by her self-assessment. Most people, even those with medical training, couldn't provide such a clear and clinical evaluation of their own condition while trapped under debris. Her description of the metallic taste and abdominal pain suggested possible internal injuries that would require immediate attention, but her calm delivery of this information was remarkable. Working quickly, Jake began clearing the smaller pieces of rubble blocking his access to the woman. Each movement had to be careful and deliberate. One wrong shift could bring more debris down on both of them. As he worked, he kept up a steady stream of conversation, partly to keep her calm and partly to gather more information about her condition. "What's your name?" he asked, lifting a chunk of concrete that looked like it had once been part of a decorative column. "Zara," she replied without hesitation. "Zara Ahmadi." "Okay, Zara. I'm Jake. I'm going to get you out of here, but I need you to stay as still as possible while I work. Can you feel your toes?" "Yes." Both feet respond normally. "The pressure is just above my left knee, and I can still move my ankle." Again, Jake was struck by her precise medical terminology. Most civilians would simply say their leg hurt or felt stuck. Zara's responses suggested either medical training or extensive experience with injuries. Perhaps she was a nurse or doctor. That would explain her composure and clinical self-assessment. As Jake continued clearing debris, the sound of gunfire erupted from somewhere deeper in the building. His teammates were obviously in contact with enemy forces, which meant his window for safely extracting all the wounded was rapidly closing. He could hear Rodriguez's voice shouting orders, coordinating defensive positions while trying to treat their own casualties. "Zara, I need to work faster. This might hurt, but I'm going to lift this beam off your leg. On three, okay." "Wait," she said, her voice taking on a note of authority that made Jake pause. "Check the structural integrity of that support post behind you first. If it's cracked, moving the beam could bring down more debris." Jake looked over his shoulder at the concrete post she indicated. Sure enough, there was a hairline crack running up its length, something he had missed in his rush to reach her. If he had lifted the beam without checking, the additional stress could have caused a partial collapse that might have killed them both. "Good catch," he said, genuinely impressed. "Are you in construction or engineering?" Zara didn't answer directly, but Jake caught something in her expression, a flicker of something that might have been amusement or perhaps frustration. Instead of responding to his question, she began pointing out the safest route for debris removal, identifying which pieces could be moved without compromising the remaining structure. Working together, they methodically cleared a path to her trapped leg. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that Zara knew more about tactical medicine and structural assessment than most civilians, but he pushed the thought aside. Right now, his only concern was getting her stable enough to move. When he finally reached her leg, Jake's assessment confirmed her self-diagnosis. The limb was pinned, but not obviously broken, though significant swelling was already beginning. More concerning was the pallor of her skin and the way she unconsciously guarded her left side when she moved. "I'm going to start on 4 and give you something for the pain," Jake explained, opening his medical kit. "Then we'll figure out how to get you mobile." As he prepared the 4 needle, Zara watched his every movement with an intensity that made him slightly uncomfortable. Most patients either looked away during medical procedures or watched with curiosity or fear. Zara's gaze was evaluative, as if she was mentally cataloging his techniques and equipment. "You carry fentanyl in your field kit," she observed, noting the medication he was preparing. "Most civilian paramedics use morphine." Jake's hand stilled for a moment. She was right. Fentanyl was primarily used by military medics because of its rapid onset and potency in combat situations. A civilian would be unlikely to recognize it, let alone comment on the choice of medication. "Are you medical personnel?" he asked directly, meeting her gaze. For a long moment, Zara didn't respond. The sound of gunfire was getting closer, and Jake could hear his team leader calling for a status update on the civilian extraction. Finally, she nodded slightly. "I have some medical training," she said carefully. "Field medicine, trauma treatment." The way she phrased it sent a chill down Jake's spine. Field medicine wasn't something you learned in civilian medical school. It was a specialty taught to military medics, emergency responders, and others who worked in dangerous environments where standard hospital procedures weren't available. Before he could ask more questions, an explosion shook the building, sending more dust cascading down from the damaged ceiling. Rodriguez's voice crackled urgently through Jake's radio. "Harrison, we need to move now. Enemy reinforcements inbound. ETA 5 minutes." Jake quickly inserted the 4 and pushed the pain medication, watching as Zara's face relaxed slightly. But even under the influence of fentanyl, Her eyes remained sharp and alert, tracking every sound from outside their makeshift shelter. "Can you walk if I support you?" Jake asked, helping her work her leg free from the remaining debris. "I think so," Zara replied, testing her weight gingerly. "But Jake, there's something you should know about this neighborhood." She paused, wincing as she shifted position, then continued with the same tactical precision she'd shown throughout their encounter. 3 blocks north, there's a weapons cache hidden in what looks like an abandoned shop. The building we're in now, it's not random that it was hit. This whole area is a Taliban supply route, and they'll fight hard to keep control of it. Jake stared at her in shock. The kind of detailed intelligence about enemy positions and supply networks wasn't something a civilian medical worker would know. Even most coalition forces wouldn't have that level of specific information about the local area. "How do you know that?" he asked quietly. Before Zara could answer, the sound of boots on rubble announced the arrival of someone else. Jake spun around, weapon ready, but relaxed when he recognized Petty Officer Second Class Maria Santos, his teammate's voice calling out their position. "Jake, we need to go now," Santos shouted. "Chief says we've got company coming fast." As Santos helped support Zara's other side, Jake noticed something that made his blood run cold. Despite her obvious pain and the medication in her system, Zara was moving with a fluid grace that spoke of extensive training. More tellingly, her eyes were constantly scanning for threats, checking corners, and potential ambush points with the automatic reflexes of someone who had been in combat situations many times before. The three of them made their way through the ruined building, moving as quickly as Zara's injured leg would allow. As they emerged into the harsh sunlight, Jake could see the rest of his team providing security around 2 other wounded soldiers who were being prepared for evacuation. Rodriguez appeared at Jake's side, his face grim with the stress of coordinating multiple casualties under fire. "How's our civilian?" "Stable for now," Jake replied. "But, Chief, I think there's something." His words were cut off by the sharp crack of sniper fire. The bullet struck the wall inches from Rodriguez's head, sending chunks of concrete flying. Instantly, the entire team dropped to covered positions, weapons ready, scanning for the source of the shot. But it was Zara who spoke first, her voice calm and professional despite their desperate situation. "Sniper, approximately 300 meters, second floor of the blue building northwest of our position. He's got thermal imaging, which is how he tracked us through the dust cloud." The entire team turned to stare at her in stunned silence. Not only had she identified the threat faster than any of them, but she had provided the kind of detailed tactical assessment that came from extensive combat experience. No civilian, regardless of medical training, should have been able to make that kind of precise evaluation under fire. Rodriguez's eyes narrowed as he looked at Zara with new understanding. "Ma'am, I think we need to have a conversation about exactly who you are." But before anyone could respond, the sound of approaching vehicles announced the arrival of enemy reinforcements. The next few minutes would determine whether any of them made it out alive, and Jake was beginning to realize that the woman they had risked their lives to rescue might be far more dangerous and far more valuable than any of them had imagined. The mystery of Zara Ahmadi was just beginning to unfold, and Jake had the unsettling feeling that everything he thought he knew about their mission was about to change dramatically. As he prepared for the fight that was coming, one question echoed in his mind. Who was this woman, and why did she know more about their enemy than his own intelligence briefings had told him? The answers would have to wait. Right now, survival was the only priority, but Jake knew that when the shooting stopped, he would need to find out the truth about the mysterious woman whose life he had just saved and who might have just saved all of theirs. The firefight erupted with the sudden violence that Jake had come to expect in Afghanistan, but somehow this felt different. As bullets cracked overhead and his team scrambled for better defensive positions, he found himself watching Zara Ahmadi with growing amazement. Despite her injury and the powerful pain medication coursing through her system, she moved with the calculated precision of someone who had been in similar situations countless times before. "Santos, take the wounded to that building," Rodriguez barked, pointing to a more defensible position 50 meters to their east. "Harrison, stay with the civilian." But as Jake moved to help support Zara, she was already scanning the approaching Taliban fighters with an intensity that made him deeply uncomfortable. Her dark eyes tracked movement patterns, evaluated weapon positions, and assessed tactical vulnerabilities with the expertise of a seasoned combat veteran. "Chief," she called out to Rodriguez, her voice cutting through the chaos with military authority, "you've got a technical approaching from the south. PKM machine gun mounted, but the gunner is exposed on his left side. Your saw gunner has a clean shot from that rubble pile." Rodriguez's head snapped toward her, his expression shifting from confusion to sharp attention. Zara's assessment was not only accurate, but delivered with the kind of tactical precision that came from extensive combat experience. This was not the behavior of a civilian medical worker caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. "Who the hell are you?" Rodriguez demanded, but his question was lost in the roar of incoming fire. The Taliban technical vehicle Zara had identified came roaring around the corner, its mounted PKM machine gun spraying suppressive fire across their position. True to her prediction, the gunner was indeed vulnerable from the angle she had indicated. Petty Officer Jackson, their saw gunner, took the shot without hesitation. The gunner slumped forward, and the technicals swerved wildly before crashing into a concrete barrier. Jake watched Zara's reaction to the violence unfolding around them, looking for signs of shock or trauma that would be natural for a civilian. Instead, he saw her mentally cataloging ammunition expenditure, tracking enemy movement, and evaluating their team's defensive capabilities with the cool professionalism of someone who understood warfare at a fundamental level. "Zara," Jake said quietly, "I need to know who you really are. My team's lives might depend on it." For a moment, her carefully maintained facade cracked, and Jake saw something vulnerable and deeply tired in her expression. But before she could respond, another voice called out from behind a nearby wall. "Zara Ahmadi, you're a difficult woman to kill." The voice spoke in accented English, carrying a tone of grudging respect mixed with deadly intent. Jake turned to see a bearded Taliban commander emerging from cover, flanked by two fighters. The commander's eyes were fixed solely on Zara, ignoring the American soldiers entirely. "Commander Khalil," Zara replied, her voice steady despite their desperate situation. "Still wearing that same tactical vest, I see. The one with the ceramic plate that has a stress fracture on the lower left corner." Jake's blood ran cold. Not only did Zara know this enemy commander by name, but she was familiar with specific details about his equipment. This level of intelligence suggested either extensive surveillance or direct previous contact. Either possibility painted a picture that Jake was not prepared to accept. Commander Khalil smiled coldly, raising his AK-47. "You killed my brother in Helmand Province. Today, I return the favor." The world seemed to slow down as Jake processed what he was hearing. Zara hadn't just happened to be in this building when the attack started. She was the target. The entire ambush, the strategic positioning, the weapons cache she had mentioned, all of it was connected to this woman whose life he had just risked everything to save. But as Khalil's finger tightened on the trigger, Zara moved with a speed that defied her injuries and medication. Despite the 4 lines still attached to her arm and her obviously painful leg injury, she rolled behind cover with fluid grace, simultaneously drawing a pistol that Jake had somehow failed to notice during his medical examination. The gunfight that followed was unlike anything Jake had experienced in his military career. Zara fought with a combination of tactical brilliance and ruthless efficiency that spoke of extensive special operations training. She wasn't just defending herself. She was actively coordinating with Rodriguez's team, providing real-time intelligence about enemy positions and movement patterns. 3 fighters moving up the east alley, she called out, her voice calm despite the chaos. "They're carrying RPGs, but they'll need line of sight to use them effectively. If Jackson can suppress the north position, Santos can flank them from that drainage culvert." Rodriguez executed her tactical suggestions without question, his years of experience telling him that this woman, Whoever she was knew exactly what she was talking about. The coordination between Zara and his team was seamless, as if they had trained together for months rather than meeting less than an hour ago. As the firefight intensified, Jake found himself in the surreal position of providing medical support while trying to understand the true nature of the woman he was treating. Every tactical decision she made, every piece of intelligence she provided, painted a picture of someone with extensive special operations experience. "Zara," he said during a brief lull in the shooting, "were you military?" She glanced at him while reloading her weapon with practiced efficiency. "It's complicated, Jake. Right now, the important thing is getting your team out of here alive." "Were you American military?" he pressed, beginning to suspect an answer he wasn't sure he wanted to hear. Before Zara could respond, Rodriguez's radio crackled with an urgent transmission from their base. "Bravo team, be advised we have new intelligence on your position. The civilian casualty you reported is actually Zara Ahmadi, former CIA operative, currently wanted by multiple terrorist organizations. She's been dark for 6 months." The silence that followed this transmission was deafening. Jake stared at Zara, his mind reeling as pieces of a complex puzzle began falling into place. Her medical knowledge, her tactical expertise, her familiarity with the area and enemy operations, it all made sense now. She wasn't a civilian caught in the crossfire. She was a CIA operative whose cover had been blown. "Is it true?" Jake asked quietly. Zara met his eyes with an expression of profound weariness. "Former CIA, yes. The wanted by terrorist organizations part is unfortunately also accurate. And, Jake, I've been hiding in this neighborhood for 3 weeks, waiting for extraction that never came." The implications of this revelation hit Jake like a physical blow. The CIA had abandoned her. She had been living as a fugitive in one of the most dangerous places on Earth, using her training to stay alive while her own government wrote her off as expendable. "Why didn't you identify yourself when we found you?" Rodriguez demanded, his tactical radio now squawking with urgent requests for situation updates. "Because," Zara replied, wincing as she shifted position to get a better firing angle, "the last American team that knew my real identity ended up feeding information to Taliban intelligence. I didn't know if I could trust you." Jake felt sick. The realization that American forces might have been compromised, that Zara's mission had been betrayed from within, cast everything in a new light. She hadn't been hiding from just the Taliban. She had been hiding from potential traitors within her own organization. The radio crackled again, this time with a different voice, older, more authoritative. "Bravo team, this is Colonel Matthews. Zara Ahmadi is to be considered a priority asset. Whatever it takes, get her out of there." "Copy that, sir," Rodriguez replied, but Jake could see the conflict in his team leader's eyes. Orders from a colonel carried significant weight, but the tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. Taliban reinforcements were arriving, and their ammunition was running low. "Colonel," Zara said, taking Rodriguez's radio without permission, "this is Blackbird. Authentication code Sierra 7 Victor 9. There was a long pause before the colonel responded. "Confirmed, Blackbird. We thought you were dead." "Reports of my death were greatly exaggerated," Zara replied dryly. "Sir, I have intelligence on a major Taliban operation plan for next week. But right now, Bravo team is pinned down because of my presence here. They need immediate close air support." Jake listened to this exchange with growing understanding. Zara wasn't just any CIA operative. Her call sign and the colonel's reaction suggested she was someone of significant importance. The intelligence she mentioned could be vital to preventing future attacks. "Air support is 12 minutes out." The colonel's voice crackled through the radio. "Hold your position." "Sir," Rodriguez interjected, "we may not have 12 minutes. We're down to about 60 rounds per man, and they keep bringing up more fighters." Zara looked around their defensive position, her tactical mind clearly working through their options. Jake could see her calculating distances, ammunition supplies, and enemy capabilities with the same clinical precision she had used to assess her own injuries. "There's another option," she said finally. "But It's going to require trust, and some of you aren't going to like it. Rodriguez looked at her suspiciously. What kind of option? I've been living in this neighborhood for weeks. I know every building, every tunnel, every escape route. There's a way out, but it goes through Taliban-controlled territory, and we'll have to move like we're part of their operation. The idea of disguising themselves as Taliban fighters was both tactically sound and ethically complicated. Jake could see Rodriguez wrestling with the decision, knowing that unconventional tactics might be their only chance for survival. What would we need to do? Rodriguez asked finally. Zara outlined a plan that was both brilliant and terrifying in its simplicity. Using equipment from the Taliban fighters they had already neutralized, they could disguise themselves as a patrol escorting prisoners. The route she proposed would take them through areas that conventional wisdom said were impenetrable, but her intimate knowledge of the terrain made it possible. As they prepared to implement Zara's plan, Jake found himself working alongside a woman who continued to surprise him. Despite her injuries and the betrayal she had endured from her own organization, she was risking everything to save his team. Her actions spoke of a code of honor that transcended national boundaries or organizational loyalty. Zara, Jake said as they gathered equipment from the fallen Taliban fighters, why are you doing this? You could probably disappear on your own. Start over somewhere safe. She paused in her preparation, looking at him with eyes that held years of accumulated pain and determination. Because, Jake, when everything else fails, your mission, your organization, your country, the only thing left is doing what's right for the people standing next to you. Her words carried the weight of hard experience, of someone who had learned that survival often depended on the strength of personal bonds rather than institutional loyalty. Jake realized that despite her mysterious past and complicated allegiances, Zara Ahmadi was someone he could trust with his life. As they began their dangerous journey through enemy territory, Jake understood that this mission had become something far more complex than a simple rescue operation. They weren't just trying to save their own lives. They were protecting someone whose intelligence could prevent future attacks, whose experience could save other American lives, and whose personal sacrifice had already cost her everything she had once believed in. The disguise worked better than any of them had dared hope, but Jake knew the real test was still ahead. Getting out of the immediate area was only the beginning. The larger questions about CIA operations, about betrayal within American forces, about Zara's future remained unanswered. As they moved through the dusty streets of Kandahar, Jake realized that his simple medical training had not prepared him for the moral complexities of modern warfare. The woman whose life he had saved was not just another casualty. She was a symbol of everything that was both heroic and tragic about America's presence in Afghanistan. The disguise held as they moved through the narrow alleyways of Kandahar, but Jake could feel the tension radiating from every member of his team. Walking through Taliban-controlled territory dressed as enemy fighters was psychological warfare at its most intense. Every face they passed could belong to someone who might recognize them. Every corner could hide an ambush, and every step took them deeper into hostile territory. Zara led them with the confidence of someone who had mapped every street during her weeks in hiding. Despite her injured leg and the pain medication, she maintained the bearing of a Taliban commander, barking orders in Pashto to Rodriguez and Santos, who played the role of prisoners with convincing reluctance. Jake, posing as a Taliban medic, stayed close to her side, ready to provide real medical support if her condition deteriorated. The checkpoint is 2 blocks ahead, Zara said quietly in English, her voice barely audible beneath the traditional Taliban head wrap she now wore. Real Taliban fighters, not just local militia. They'll ask questions. Rodriguez, his hands bound behind his back with loose rope that could be quickly removed, gave a barely perceptible nod. What's our story? You're American soldiers captured during the ambush. I'm taking you to Commander Khalil's stronghold for interrogation. Zara's voice carried a note of dark irony. Since Khalil is currently dead back at our original position, no one at this checkpoint will be able to verify the order immediately. The plan was audacious in its simplicity, but Jake could see the flaws that might get them all killed. If anyone at the checkpoint had radio contact with the site of their firefight, if anyone recognized Zara despite her disguise, if his own limited Dari language skills were tested, any number of variables could expose them. As they approached the checkpoint, Jake's medical training took over, focusing his attention on details that could mean the difference between life and death. He noticed that Zara was favoring her injured leg more than she had been earlier, suggesting that the pain medication was wearing off and inflammation was increasing. Her breathing was also slightly elevated, which could indicate worsening internal bleeding. "Zara," he said quietly in Dari, playing his role while expressing real medical concern, "your condition is getting worse." "How much farther?" "20 minutes if we don't encounter delays," she replied, also in Dari, but Jake caught the slight tremor in her voice that suggested she was pushing herself beyond safe limits. The checkpoint consisted of 3 Taliban fighters manning an improvised barrier made from concrete blocks and salvaged metal. Their weapons were well-maintained AK-47s, and their equipment suggested they were more professional than the militia fighters they had encountered earlier. One of them, a man with a distinctive scar across his left cheek, stepped forward as their group approached. Zara immediately began speaking in rapid Pashto, her tone authoritative and impatient. Jake understood enough to follow the basic outline. She was claiming to be transporting valuable prisoners and expressing frustration at being delayed. The scarred Taliban fighter responded with questions that sounded routine, but Jake could see suspicion growing in his eyes. The conversation continued for several tense minutes, with Zara providing increasingly elaborate details about her fictional orders. Jake used the time to assess their tactical situation, noting the positions of the other fighters and identifying potential cover if the situation went wrong. But what concerned him most was watching Zara's condition continue to deteriorate as she maintained her demanding performance. Finally, the scarred fighter seemed satisfied with her answers, but as they turned to leave, he called out one more question. Jake didn't understand the words, but he saw Zara's body stiffen almost imperceptibly. When she responded, her voice carried a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. The Taliban fighter stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he studied Zara's face more carefully. Jake realized with growing horror that the man was beginning to recognize her despite the disguise. Years of CIA operations in this region meant there would be people who knew her face, people who had reason to want her captured or killed. "Problem," Santos muttered under his breath, apparently recognizing the change in the situation despite not understanding the language. The scarred fighter raised his weapon, shouting something that brought his companions running. Jake saw Zara's hand move toward the pistol hidden beneath her Taliban robes, but her injured condition and the close quarters made any aggressive action extremely dangerous. "Wait," she said loudly in English, switching languages to address Jake and the team. "I need medical attention. My leg wound is bleeding again." It was a desperate gambit, using her legitimate medical needs as a distraction. Jake immediately moved to examine her leg, hoping to buy precious seconds while they figured out their next move. But as he knelt beside her, Zara whispered urgently in English, "The fighter with the scar knows me. When I give the signal, Santos needs to take him down first. He's the most experienced. Rodriguez should go for the radio operator on the right. Jackson, suppress the 3rd fighter from behind that concrete block." Jake was amazed by her ability to develop tactical plans even while fighting pain and blood loss, but he was also terrified by the implications. A firefight at this checkpoint would bring every Taliban fighter in the area down on them, and they were still miles from friendly territory. The scarred fighter was now speaking rapidly into a handheld radio, obviously calling for backup or verification. Time was running out quickly, and Jake could see that Zara was preparing to initiate combat despite her medical condition. "There might be another way," Jake said quietly, an idea forming based on his medical knowledge and understanding of local culture. "Trust me." Before anyone could stop him, Jake stood up and began speaking in Dari, addressing the scarred fighter directly. His pronunciation was imperfect, but his meaning was clear. The woman was seriously injured and needed immediate medical evacuation. He claimed she was the sister of an important Taliban commander, and that her death would bring severe consequences. The cultural importance of protecting women, even in combat situations, was something Jake had learned during his deployment. By reframing Zara as a female relative of Taliban leadership, rather than a disguised prisoner escort, he hoped to activate protective instincts that might override suspicion. The scarred fighter looked uncertain, clearly torn between his growing suspicions and the cultural mandate Jake was invoking. Meanwhile, Zara played her part perfectly, allowing her pain to show more obviously while maintaining enough dignity to seem like someone important enough to protect. "My brother will have your head if I die because of your delays," she said in Pashto, her voice carrying just the right mixture of pain and authority. Jake could see the internal debate playing out in the Taliban fighter's expression. Killing an American CIA operative would be a significant victory, but executing the sister of a Taliban commander based on uncertain identification would be a catastrophic mistake that could cost him his own life. Finally, the scarred fighter made his decision. Barking orders to his companions, he gestured for them to continue through the checkpoint. But Jake could see that he was also continuing his radio conversation, undoubtedly requesting clarification from higher authority. "We have maybe 10 minutes before they figure out the truth," Zara said as they moved away from the checkpoint. "My story won't hold up under scrutiny." Rodriguez, his hands now freed from the loose bindings, checked his concealed weapon while maintaining the appearance of a dejected prisoner. "How much farther to friendly territory?" 15 minutes to the closest American patrol route," Zara replied, "but we'll have to cross 2 more Taliban positions. And Jake is right about my condition. I'm not going to be able to maintain this pace much longer." Jake could see that she was fighting to stay conscious. The combination of blood loss, pain, and physical exertion was taking its toll despite her remarkable endurance. As a medic, he knew she needed immediate surgical intervention, but as a soldier, he understood that stopping now would mean death for all of them. "I can carry you," he offered, but Zara shook her head. "A Taliban commander doesn't get carried by a medic. It would blow our cover immediately." Instead, she proposed a modification to their plan that demonstrated both her tactical brilliance and her understanding of her own limitations. Rather than trying to bluff their way past 2 more checkpoints, they would take a more dangerous but faster route through abandoned buildings and drainage tunnels that she had mapped during her weeks in hiding. The route she described would take them through areas heavily damaged by fighting, where the risk of structural collapse was significant, but the likelihood of encountering organized Taliban positions was much lower. It was a calculated risk that traded the danger of combat for the danger of environmental hazards. As they began their journey through the ruins, Jake found himself impressed once again by Zara's intimate knowledge of the urban terrain. She led them through a maze of collapsed buildings and improvised passages that would have been nearly impossible to navigate without detailed reconnaissance. But her condition continued to worsen. Jake could see increasing pallor in her complexion and noted that her movements were becoming less coordinated. The pain medication had completely worn off, and her injuries were affecting her ability to make the precise movements required by their dangerous route. "We need to stop," Jake said finally, catching her as she stumbled while crossing a gap between buildings. "You're going into shock." "Can't stop," she replied, but her voice was weaker now. "Radio chatter indicates they've figured out our deception. Taliban teams are converging on this area." Rodriguez appeared at Jake's other side, helping support Zara's weight as they continued moving. "How did they figure it out so quickly?" "Someone at that checkpoint must have had direct contact with the real Commander Khalil's unit," Zara explained, her tactical mind still functioning despite her physical deterioration. "When they couldn't raise him on the radio, they knew something was wrong." The implications were clear. They were now being actively hunted by multiple Taliban teams who knew their approximate location and would be coordinating their search efforts. The advantage of their disguise was gone, but they were still deep in hostile territory with limited ammunition and a wounded team member who was critical to their survival. Jake's medical training told him that Zara had maybe 30 minutes before her condition became life-threatening, but his military experience suggested they needed at least an hour to reach safety. The mathematics of survival were working against them, and every decision from this point forward would involve impossible choices between speed and medical care. As they reached the edge of the ruined district, Jake could hear the sound of vehicle engines and coordinated radio chatter that indicated their pursuers were getting closer. The final phase of their escape would require everything they had learned about each other during this impossible day, and Jake realized that Zara Ahmadi, CIA operative, medical professional, tactical genius, and wounded human being, represented everything that was both heroic and tragic about America's mission in Afghanistan. The next hour would determine not just whether they survived, but whether the intelligence Zara carried would ever reach the people who needed it to prevent future attacks. Jake prepared himself for the most challenging medical and military operation of his career, knowing that failure would mean death for his team and the loss of information that could save countless American lives. The abandoned factory on the outskirts of Kandahar offered temporary shelter, but Jake knew they had perhaps 20 minutes before Taliban search teams reached their position. Zara had collapsed as soon as they reached cover, her remarkable endurance finally, overcome by blood loss and exhaustion. As Jake worked to stabilize her condition with his remaining medical supplies, he could hear the distant sound of vehicles and voices that indicated their pursuers were systematically searching the area. Her blood pressure is dropping, Jake reported to Rodriguez while establishing a new line. I need to get her to a surgical facility within the next hour, or we're going to lose her. Rodriguez was coordinating with their base through encrypted communications, trying to arrange emergency extraction while monitoring Taliban radio frequencies on a capture device. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly as enemy forces closed in from multiple directions. Closest friendly position is still 40 minutes away, Rodriguez reported grimly. And intelligence indicates Taliban forces are setting up roadblocks on all the main routes. Zara, despite her weakened condition, managed to open her eyes and focus on their conversation. There's still the drainage tunnel system, she said weakly. Connects to the irrigation network outside the city. But it's partially flooded, and some sections might be too narrow for full combat gear. Jake looked at his patient with a mixture of admiration and medical concern. Even while fighting for consciousness, she was still providing tactical intelligence that could save their lives. But her suggestion also highlighted the impossible nature of their situation. The route she proposed would require them to move through confined, flooded spaces while she was in critical medical condition. I can't treat her properly in drainage tunnels, Jake said to Rodriguez. And if she loses consciousness in a flooded section, we could lose her to drowning before we ever reach safety. The sound of approaching vehicles was getting closer, and Santos reported movement at the perimeter that suggested they had been spotted. Time was running out for any decision, good or bad. There's something else, Zara said, her voice barely above a whisper. The intelligence I've been carrying, it's not just about next week's operation. There's a major attack planned against the American embassy in Kabul. Coordinated assault, inside information about security procedures. Rodriguez's head snapped toward her. When? 72 hours from now. Maybe less. Zara struggled to sit up, wincing with the effort. The information is encrypted on a memory device I've been carrying. If something happens to me, you need to get it to Colonel Matthews. Jake felt the weight of this revelation settle over the team like a physical burden. They weren't just trying to save one CIA operative. They were protecting intelligence that could prevent a catastrophic attack on one of America's most important diplomatic facilities. Where's the device? Rodriguez asked. Zara reached inside her clothing and produced a small, sealed container no bigger than a pill bottle. Everything is on here. Taliban infiltration of embassy security, planned timing, specific vulnerabilities they intend to exploit. The implications were staggering. If the Taliban had successfully placed operatives within embassy security, The planned attack would have inside knowledge of defensive measures, personnel schedules, and structural weaknesses. The potential casualty count could be enormous. All the more reason to get you out of here alive, Jake said, checking her pulse and noting the continued deterioration in her vital signs. You're the only one who can provide context for that intelligence. But even as he spoke, Jake could see that Zara was beginning to understand the mathematical reality of their situation. The team could possibly escape through the drainage tunnels, but carrying a critically wounded person through flooded, confined spaces would slow them down enough to ensure capture. The choice was becoming clear: save the intelligence or save the woman. No, Rodriguez said firmly when he saw the direction of Zara's thoughts. We don't leave people behind. That's not how this works. Zara looked at each of them with eyes that held years of accumulated wisdom about the harsh realities of intelligence work. Sometimes, Rodriguez, saving people means making choices that feel like abandoning them. That intelligence could save hundreds of American lives. The sound of gunfire erupted from outside the factory as Santos engaged the advancing Taliban forces. Their window for any escape route was rapidly closing, and Jake realized they were facing one of those impossible decisions that defined modern warfare: the needs of the many versus loyalty to the individual. There might be another way, Jake said suddenly, an idea forming based on his medical knowledge and understanding of the local terrain. The old Soviet medical facility, 3 kilometers north. It was abandoned, but some of the equipment might still be functional. Zara shook her head weakly. That area has been Taliban control for months. It would be suicide to try to reach it. Not if they think you're already dead, Jake replied, his plan becoming clearer as he spoke. We fake your death here, get the intelligence out through the tunnels, then circle back to extract you from the medical facility. The plan was desperate and complex, requiring precise timing and enormous risks. They would need to convince Taliban forces that Zara had died in the factory, stage enough evidence to make it believable, then somehow get her to the abandoned medical facility where Jake could provide more extensive treatment while they waited for a real extraction. The Taliban will want to see a body, Rodriguez pointed out, and they'll recognize her face. Jake had already thought of that. Explosive devices, structural collapse, fire damage. There are ways to make identification impossible while still providing evidence of death. But Zara would have to remain hidden and motionless for possibly hours while we create the deception. Zara considered the proposal with the analytical mind that had kept her alive through months of dangerous operations. It could work, she said finally, but the medical facility is in worse condition than you realize. Most of the equipment was looted or destroyed years ago. I don't need much, Jake replied. Basic surgical tools, some antibiotics for fluids. Enough to stabilize you until we can arrange proper extraction. The sound of gunfire was intensifying, and Santos called out that he was running low on ammunition. Whatever decision they made had to be implemented immediately. Do it, Rodriguez ordered. Jake, how much time do you need to prepare the medical deception? Working quickly, Jake used his remaining medical supplies to create the appearance of a fatal injury. The process required him to use some of his own blood, along with creative arrangement of medical waste and torn clothing, to stage a scene that would convince Taliban investigators that Zara had died from her wounds. Meanwhile, Zara provided detailed instructions for reaching the abandoned medical facility through a route that avoided known Taliban positions. Despite her weakening condition, her knowledge of local terrain and enemy patrol patterns remained remarkably detailed. There's a basement level that's partially intact, she explained while Jake worked to make her appear dead. Soviet-era construction, thick concrete walls. If you can get me there, I can stay hidden until extraction is possible. The plan required Zara to remain absolutely motionless while Taliban forces searched the factory, potentially for hours, while dealing with serious medical conditions that required constant attention. It was asking her to risk death by neglect in order to avoid death by capture. As Taliban voices grew closer to their position, Jake made his final preparations. He had given Zara enough pain medication to help her remain unconscious during the search, but not so much that it would dangerously suppress her breathing or blood pressure. The margin for error was incredibly small. If this doesn't work, Zara said, just before the medication took effect, make sure that intelligence reaches the right people. The embassy attack can be prevented, but only if they know it's coming. Jake squeezed her hand reassuringly. It's going to work. I'll see you at the medical facility. The next several hours represented the most challenging period of Jake's military and medical career. After staging Zara's apparent death and escaping through the drainage tunnels with his team, they had to circle back through hostile territory to reach the abandoned medical facility while avoiding Taliban patrols that were now actively searching for them. The facility itself was even more damaged than Zara had indicated. Years of warfare and neglect had left most of the building in ruins, but the basement level was indeed structurally intact. Jake found enough salvageable medical equipment to establish a basic treatment area, though it was far from the sterile surgical environment that Zara's condition really required. When they finally extracted her from the factory, a process that required infiltrating a building now occupied by Taliban forces celebrating their apparent victory, Jake discovered that her condition had deteriorated even further. The hours of forced immobility had worsened her internal injuries, and she was now showing signs of infection that could quickly become life-threatening. Working in the basement of the abandoned medical facility with minimal equipment and constant fear of discovery, Jake provided medical care that tested every aspect of his training. He performed emergency surgery using improvised tools, administered antibiotics with uncertain potency, and monitored vital signs with equipment that was decades old. Throughout the process, Zara remained conscious enough to provide continued intelligence guidance. She helped Rodriguez coordinate with Base Command to verify the authenticity of her intelligence data and provide context for the planned embassy attack. Her information proved accurate and detailed enough to allow American forces to begin immediate countermeasures. The attack was scheduled for tomorrow morning, she explained during one of her more lucid moments. Dawn prayers, when embassy security staffing is at minimum levels. They've been planning this for months. Thanks to her intelligence, American forces were able to identify and neutralize the Taliban infiltrators within embassy security, reinforce defensive positions, and coordinate with Afghan allies to prevent the attack entirely. The operation that began with a simple medical evacuation had evolved into a counterterrorism success that potentially saved hundreds of lives. But the personal cost remained significant. Zara's injuries, complicated by the extended delays in proper treatment, would require months of recovery even with the best medical care available. Her CIA career was effectively over, both because of her physical condition and because her cover had been permanently compromised. As they waited for the helicopter extraction that finally arrived after 36 hours in the abandoned medical facility, Jake reflected on the extraordinary woman whose life had become intertwined with his team's mission. Zara Ahmadi represented both the best and the worst aspects of America's involvement in Afghanistan. Brilliant, dedicated, and willing to sacrifice everything for her mission, but ultimately abandoned by the system she served and saved only by the personal loyalty of soldiers who refused to leave her behind. What happens now? Jake asked as they prepared Zara for medical evacuation. Now, she replied with a tired smile, I get to find out what life looks like when you're not constantly looking over your shoulder for people trying to kill you. The helicopter lifted off from the facility as Taliban forces finally located their position, but by then it was too late. Zara Ahmadi was safe. Her intelligence had prevented a major terrorist attack, and Jake Harrison had learned that sometimes the most important medical intervention is simply refusing to give up on a patient, no matter how impossible the circumstances become. As they flew toward the American base hospital, Jake realized that this mission had changed not just the strategic situation in Afghanistan, but his own understanding of what it meant to serve. The woman beside him, injured, exhausted, but unshaken in her commitment to protecting others, had taught him that true strength lay not in following orders or accepting impossible situations, but in making the choice to do what was right regardless of the personal cost. The story of their escape would become classified, hidden in intelligence files that few people would ever read. But for Jake, it would remain a defining moment that proved the real victories in war were measured not in territory gained or enemies defeated, but in lives saved and principles upheld when everything else had fallen apart.